Hi, folks. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most mysterious developments of the past few days and really the past few years. There's been a story circulating about how numerous scientists and UFO researchers have essentially been disappearing. To be more exact, at the making of this video, a total of 13 researchers have either disappeared or passed away, some under mysterious circumstances, since 2022. We're going to go through each case, the circumstances surrounding them, what these researchers were actually looking into, and the broader narrative being pushed not just by elected officials, but also by the media, and how all of this seems to be converging into what I believe is a massive psyop. And trust me, I have my reasons to be skeptical about the narrative that's being pushed. But before we dive into the specifics of each case, let's start from the beginning, or more specifically, some of the events that unfolded just this past week after what feels like decades of a slow drip of information about alien encounters, alien technology, and what the government may know about these non-human entities and their capabilities. We're finally starting to get something more tangible. In recent congressional hearings, we've heard from Air Force pilots, specialists, and other credible witnesses, but the actual footage is basically 360p quality, stuff that looks like it was filmed on a potato. So there's still no clear high-definition evidence that truly reveals what we're actually looking at, leaving us with a mix of eyewitness testimony and grainy footage of objects moving at extreme speeds through the air. Now, with all that in mind, the most recent development is that Donald Trump announced plans to declassify a batch of UFO and UAP-related documents, and that's where things start to get interesting.
As you remember, I recently directed the Secretary of War. How good is Pete Hegseth doing, by the way? To begin releasing government files relating to UFOs and unexplained aerial phenomena. And I figured this was a good crowd because I know you people, you're really into that. I don't know if I am, but so I'm pleased to report today, I thought I'd save it for this crowd, because you're a little bit out there, you know, a little bit, that this process is well underway, and we found many very interesting documents, I must say, and the first releases will begin very, very soon, so you can go out and see if that phenomena is correct. You'll figure it out. Let me know. Let me know. But we've had a lot of questions. It's something that really captivates the mind. There's no question about it.
Now, off the rip, there are a few different interesting things happening here. Donald Trump himself kind of tips his hand, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate Trump. Even when he's obfuscating or something else is going on, he usually gives you that sort of wink, wink, like this is what's actually going on. But look, I don't want to read too much into what he said, just point out what's clearly there. He frames this as something people are really into, says it captivates the mind, and emphasizes that it raises a lot of questions. Now, that language matters. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go through all of this, because raising a lot of questions has specific psychological effects on people. It keeps them engaged, it keeps them searching, but it doesn't necessarily give them answers. That said, we also have to look at where those questions are coming from. They're coming directly from our government, the one place that's supposed to provide the transparency necessary to answer those questions, but consistently fails to give us a full picture. It's always a little muddled. It's always leading to more questions for some reason. Now, within this dynamic, Trump is saying they found very interesting documents and that releases on UAPs, UFOs are coming very soon. And again, I don't want to overextend what Trump is saying, but wording matters. Interesting is vague. Telling people to go figure it out is not the same thing as actually providing clear, direct answers. You're inviting investigation, suspicion, skepticism, more questions, and no answers. Just think about that, folks. What would be the interest of the government to continuously have us on this wild goose chase? It's a valid question to ask, especially when you consider that at the same time, there's pressure building from Congress, including figures like Tim Burchett, who's been pushing for more disclosures on this issue. So now you have this convergence. Government pressure, public curiosity, media amplification, and then a controlled release of information that ultimately leads nowhere, just leads to more questions. So, in the spirit of questions, here's another question. What kind of release is this actually going to be? Because we've heard this before for decades. The public has been told for years that transparency is coming, but when it comes, it's only partial. It's incomplete. It looks like it was shot in a potato. An answer is just enough to keep the conversation going, but not enough to actually resolve anything. Now, keep all of that in mind as we move into this next section, because this is where it all starts tying together. In the background of this entire conversation, you have scientists and researchers connected to this topic who have either gone missing, passed away, or died under unclear circumstances. And there's a narrative building in the media around speculation as to why this happened to these individuals and their potential connections. And Trump himself has responded as this narrative started building out.
Scientists with access to classified stuff, nuclear material, aerospace, they've all gone missing or turned up dead in the last couple months. Based on what you've been briefed, what do you think is happening here, and do you think that this is connected or totally random?
Well, I hope it's random, but we're going to know in the next week and a half. I just left a meeting on that subject, so pretty serious stuff, but we're going to be hopefully, I don't know, coincidence, if you whatever you want to call it, but some of them were very important people, and we're going to look at it over the next short time.
Again, inconclusive. Donald Trump says this is hopefully a coincidence, that they're going to look into it, that they're going to see, but no answers are provided whatsoever. This remains purely in the speculative space because it creates more confusion and raises more questions. And there's a very solid reason why our government officials would benefit from creating these sorts of distractions in a moment like this. Now, with all that being said, let's jump straight into the facts about this case. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is reviewing cases of at least 10 scientists who have died or mysteriously disappeared since 2022, most of whom had connections to government research. And by the way, this isn't the only instance. This is something that's also happening across the pond. China has also seen scientists dying under mysterious circumstances, according to a report published by Newsweek 2 days ago. But even then, from our side, there's suspicion among our own government officials as to who may be responsible for these deaths.
You say in this letter that this could potentially be a, quote, grave threat to United States national security and to U.S. personnel with access to scientific secrets. Explain what you're worried about.
Well, obviously, we know that there are programs in the past where foreign countries have used programs to try to encounter, engage, sometimes get the nation's top scientists to either stop what they're doing or come and work for that country. And so whether it was Operation Paperclip or most recently you have China that's been doing Operation Fox Hunt as well as Operation Skynet. These are disturbing, but it is true that foreign actors do engage, and our scientific community are very vulnerable targets.
Now, this is an entirely plausible scenario. You see this play out all the time. People change allegiances. They get offered enough money, enough leverage, enough pressure to move, defect, or shut down what they're working on. Some of the operations he mentioned here are not fringe concepts. They're all very real. Operation Paperclip, for example. After World War II, the United States actively brought over German scientists, many of whom had worked with the Nazi regime, because scientific advantage mattered more than anything else. Then you have more modern examples tied to China, like Operation Fox Hunt and Operation Skynet, programs aimed at tracking, coercing, and in some cases, forcing individuals, including scientists, to return or cooperate. The world of espionage is something that is constantly evolving. It doesn't just happen in movies. It happens quietly, strategically, and often without the public ever fully understanding what's actually going on. And scientists, especially those working in aerospace, propulsion, or advanced materials, are prime targets, as was mentioned in the video. These are the people building the future of military and technological dominance. So when Representative Eric Burlison raises the possibility that foreign actors like Russia, China, or Iran could be involved, that's not some outlandish claim. It fits directly into how global power competition actually works. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because while this foreign actor explanation is entirely plausible, it's also convenient. It gives a clear external enemy. It frames the issue within a familiar national security narrative, and it keeps the focus outward. And that matters because when something is framed as a foreign threat, it narrows the scope of inquiry. It tells the public where to look, and just as importantly, where not to look. So now you have two overlapping realities. On one hand, yes, foreign governments absolutely target scientists, recruit them, pressure them, and in some cases neutralize threats to their interest. That's real. On the other hand, you have a series of deaths and disappearances connected to a highly sensitive area of research happening in the time frame of just a few years, speeding up over the last few months, and now being discussed in the context of UFO programs and the declassifying of information related to encounters and technology. Now, all that being said, let's jump into the first story, and one of the ones that invites the most scrutiny and keeps resurfacing online, Amy Eskridge. Amy Eskridge died on June 11th, 2022 in Huntsville, Alabama. Her death was officially ruled a suicide. She was 34 years old. But the reason this case continues to circulate and why it keeps getting pulled back into the broader conversation is because of who she was, where she was, and what she claimed to be working on at the time of her passing. Amy wasn't just some random internet personality making vague claims. She was a trained scientist, a plasma physicist, and some described as working across multiple disciplines, including electrical engineering and advanced propulsion concepts. She was based in Huntsville, which is not just any city. It's one of the central hubs for aerospace, defense, and government research in the United States. She had connections to NASA through her father, a retired NASA engineer, and reportedly collaborated on speculative research projects. She also co-founded the Institute for Exotic Science, an organization focused on gravity modification and frontier propulsion. So when people hear anti-gravity research, this isn't coming from nowhere. This is someone operating in a real environment tied to real institutions, even if the subject matter itself pushes into unconventional territory. Now, here's where things start to get uncomfortable and why this story doesn't just fade away. There are multiple clips of Amy online on Zoom calls, interviews, discussions where she openly talks about her research and what she believed she was uncovering. In those clips, she claims that anti-gravity had already been discovered multiple times in the past, but was suppressed each time.
It's been independently discovered 4 other times. He said it has been suppressed every single fucking time. And he said, I don't think they're going to suppress it this time. He said, I think you're in the clear. He said, they obviously know about you because I've had multiple, both protective and threatening interactions with various agency affiliations, whatever. He was like, if you haven't had a US government agent come to you and say, stop, shut the fuck up, stop, shut the fuck up. If that hasn't happened, they're going to let you do it. They're waiting. There are SSP motherfuckers that are fucking twiddling their thumbs. Like, is Amy not going to publish soon? God, we've been influencing this bitch forever. Doesn't she know we want her to publish? Jesus. Like, there's multiple people doing that right now. And on the other side of the fence, there's multiple parties looking at each other like, didn't we tell this bitch 3 years ago that we kill people for this? Is she not listening? What is she doing? She's still doing it? What? We told her we were going to kill her 3 years ago. So I have these two different scenarios floating constantly in my life where I have people being like, do it, do it, do it. You're the one, do it. And then I have multiple people being like, they're going to kill you. Don't do it. They're going to kill you.
Now, as we just saw, Amy claimed that she was being targeted. Specifically, she later shares that she was being targeted by direct energy weapons. She also shares stories of what she believes were people who are following her or tracking her movements. In other clips, she goes in depth about being under threat, about pressure tied directly to her work, and about the risks of continuing down that path as we just saw. This isn't something that was said quietly, by the way. It's on video, it's documented, and it's part of why people keep coming back to her case.
So the ultra-terrestrials, I'll just tell you. The ultra-terrestrials, I think, have you heard of the P-52s and the P-47s? Do you know what that is? They're us from the future. They're from here. They are you. They are me. They're from here, from the future. P-47 is present plus 47,000 years. P-52 is present plus 52,000 years. And basically there's a calamity, right? So there's like a apocalypse scenario in the near future. It wipes out most of like everything, man. And there's the ones that go underground and survive. Right. And then there's the ones that somehow stay on the surface and miraculously don't die.
And then there's a statement that continues to circulate every time her name comes up online. She said, "If you see any report that I killed myself, I most certainly did not." That's something she reportedly said just months before her death, and then not long after, she was found dead, officially ruled a suicide. No detailed public breakdown of the investigation, no extended transparency into what led to that conclusion, just a closed case from an official standpoint. Now, to be fair, her father has publicly stated that he believes it was a suicide. That's an important piece of this. That's not something you just dismiss, because he would actually have insight into her personal life that the public doesn't. But at the same time, you have conflicting information. Friends who say she told them she wouldn't take her own life, public statements from Amy herself suggesting the same thing, and even testimony from former UK intelligence officer Frank Milburn, who told Congress in 2023 that he does not believe her death was a suicide. So you have two narratives sitting side by side, and they don't cleanly reconcile.
Look at these 11 scientists. There's some outliers, certainly, but each one has a very mysterious and unique case. I think Amy Eskridge, her case is somewhat of an outlier, but it's worth investigating. I mean, we had Michael Schellenberger come to our hearing back in 2024, and in his testimony, he provided information from a researcher, Frank Milburn, who was a retired UK intelligence official, who Amy had reached out to and asked to investigate some of the harassment, some of the weird things that were happening with her. And he determined that she was the victim of a directed energy weapon and that she was likely murdered by a U.S. aerospace company.
And again, the mystery around these situations is part of the reason why they keep getting brought back up. It's the questions they raise. It's the lack of information. Is there a larger government conspiracy? There could very well be. But the reality is, the reason this keeps resurfacing is because nothing is ever fully resolved. There's never a clear answer, no conclusive explanation, no transparency that actually leads to a closing of this loop. And knowing how our government operates, there is very likely a plausible, grounded explanation for what happened here and to all the scientists that have disappeared. There are documents that cover and explain exactly what happened to Amy, what she was researching, and what we actually know about UAPs, but all of that remains under wraps. And that matters because it creates an environment where speculation fills that gap. And now you have statements like this from Eric Burlison saying that Amy Eskridge was likely murdered, potentially by a U.S. aerospace company, and even going as far as to suggest the use of a directed energy weapon, confirmation of what Amy herself claimed, which begs a broader question. Why was death by suicide the accepted explanation for her death when even government officials believe that she was murdered? Because think about that, folks. What the representative is claiming here is not a small claim. That's not some random person online. That's a sitting member of Congress making an assertion tied to national security, corporate power, and advanced technology. But here's the issue. Even with a claim that serious, we're still left in the same place. No confirmed evidence presented publicly, no documentation released, no clear investigative conclusion that the public can actually evaluate. It's just an air of mystery and awe. And that mystery indeed deepens because about a year after Amy's death, another scientist tied to some of America's most sensitive space programs also died. And once again, the circumstances raised a lot of questions because when you zoom out, this isn't just one isolated case. As we will see, there are 11 other cases, a total of 13 since 2022, all part of a growing list of deaths and disappearances. This time, his name is Michael David Hicks. Hicks died on July 30th, 2023 at the age of 59. He was a veteran research scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and not just another name in the lab. This is someone who spent more than 2 decades inside one of the most important scientific institutions in the country, contributing to over 80 scientific papers and playing a role in critical missions like NASA's DART asteroid defense program, the kind of technology designed to protect Earth from incoming threats. This is high-level, serious work tied directly into both scientific advancement and national security interests. And then suddenly, he was gone. His cause of death was withheld from the public. No autopsy details have surfaced. At the time, there was little to no media coverage. It barely even registered. It just passed quietly, and that's where things start to raise eyebrows because, again, people die. That happens. But when you're dealing with someone this embedded in sensitive research and basic details surrounding their death aren't made public, it creates a vacuum, which leads us to the next name in this growing list, Frank Maywald. Frank Werner Maywald, a researcher at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, died on July 4th, 2024 in Los Angeles at the age of 61. According to his obituary, reported by outlets like Men's Journal and News Nation, he specialized in space research and wasn't just loosely involved. He was directly managing advanced instrumentation work, including development of the Surface Biology and Geology VSWIR instrument and overseeing delivery of instruments for the AMRC program. This is highly technical, high-level work tied directly to NASA's scientific and exploratory capabilities. And again, just like we've seen before, the details surrounding his death are limited. His cause of death has not been publicly disclosed. No clear explanation, no breakdown, just the announcement of his passing. And once again, you're left with the same situation. A highly specialized researcher, deeply embedded in sensitive and advanced scientific work, dies. And the public is given very little information beyond that fact. And this pattern continues in what might be one of the most unsettling cases yet, because this time we're not talking about a confirmed death. We're talking about someone who simply vanished. Her name is Monica Reza. Monica Reza, also known as Monica Jacinto, is a materials science engineer with deep ties to aerospace and defense research. She spent more than 37 years at Aerojet Rocketdyne, a company that has been funded by NASA and the Air Force Research Laboratory, and before that, decades at Pratt & Whitney working on structural alloys. This isn't surface-level involvement. This is someone embedded in advanced materials science tied directly to propulsion systems and aerospace applications. She held patents, including a nickel-based superalloy, and worked on scaling materials for use in rocket engines. Her background places her squarely in the orbit of high-level, sensitive research tied to both scientific advancement and national security. And then she disappeared. Monica Reza was last seen on June 22nd, 2025, around 9:10 a.m., hiking along Angeles Crest Highway in California near the Mount Waterman area. What began as a normal hike quickly turned into something that doesn't line up clearly. According to reports, she was hiking with others, and at one point, she and a male companion began running along steep, uneven terrain, something described as unusual given the conditions. The man later stated that she was behind him, still running, but when he called out for her, there was no response. She was simply gone. Search efforts began almost immediately. Authorities issued alerts. The sheriff's department got involved, and notably the Homicide Bureau was part of the investigation, something that stands out in what would otherwise be categorized as a missing hiker case. Her scent was reportedly tracked, but only up to a hat believed to belong to her, and then it stopped completely. No continuation, no trail, no indication of where she went next. Months of coordinated search efforts, law enforcement, volunteers, organized teams have produced zero results, no confirmed sightings, no recovery, absolutely nothing. And she wasn't the only one, because you also have the case of Melissa Casillas, a 53-year-old mother from New Mexico, disappeared on June 26, 2025, under circumstances that just raise a lot of questions, leaving massive gaps for anybody who's curious about the truth. And again, this isn't just about a missing person case in isolation. The real reason her name is being pulled into this broader conversation is because of where she worked and how her disappearance unfolded. Casillas was employed at Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most sensitive government-linked research sites in the country, historically tied to nuclear weapons development, classified research, and high-level national security projects. Now look at the timeline, because this is where things start to break down. On the day she disappeared, Casillas had a normal interaction. She dropped lunch off for her daughter at work and told family members she'd be working from home. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then, around 2:18 p.m., she's captured on surveillance footage walking briskly eastbound along State Road 518 toward Pot Creek. And after that, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no clear trail, no explanation for where she went or why. And then you look at what was left behind. Her car was still parked outside her home. Her keys, wallet, purse, all still there. Both her work phone and personal phone left behind as well. That alone is already unusual, but then it gets even stranger. Investigators later found that both of her phones had been factory reset after she vanished. Not misplaced, not damaged, reset. Which raises a very obvious question. Who reset them? Then you have the recovery of a pair of shoes matching the ones she was last seen wearing, found in Carson National Forest, not neatly placed, not part of a clear trail, just found, pending DNA confirmation. And again, you're left with fragments, pieces of a story that don't really connect into a clear, linear explanation as to what happened to Melissa. Now, what's even more strange is a disappearance from that same laboratory. Anthony Sanchez, a 78-year-old retiree who previously worked as a foreman supervising construction at Los Alamos National Laboratory, also disappeared in May 2025. So now you're not just looking at one case tied to that facility. You have multiple individuals, different roles, different backgrounds, all connected to the same place and all vanishing under circumstances that don't fully add up. Now, according to the Los Alamos police, there are no signs of foul play. A detective even told CNN that there's no evidence suggesting anything criminal occurred, but at the same time, they've conducted exhaustive searches and turned up absolutely nothing. No signs of activity, no indication he planned to leave, no clear explanation for where he went. And that's the part that keeps this in the same unresolved category we've been seeing across all of these cases. Which brings us to the next mystery. Joshua LeBlanc was a 29-year-old aerospace technologies electrical engineer working at NASA, specifically on nuclear propulsion projects, some of the most advanced and sensitive work being done right now in space and defense. He had been with NASA for over 5 years and was a team lead on space nuclear propulsion instrumentation and control systems, and later on the Draco program, which is focused on nuclear thermal propulsion for deep space travel. This is not entry-level work. This is cutting-edge technology tied directly to future missions to Mars and beyond. And then, on July 22nd, 2025, everything goes sideways. Early that morning, around 4:32 a.m., his family reports him missing. This is already out of character. He hadn't shown up to work, he wasn't communicating, and according to his family, he had left behind his phone and wallet at home. That alone doesn't line up with someone just going about their day. Then hours later, his Tesla is found in Huntsville, Alabama, burned beyond recognition after crashing into a guardrail, then trees, before bursting into flames. His body was inside, also burned beyond recognition, and had to be identified days later through forensic analysis. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. Investigators used Tesla's Sentry Mode data to track the vehicle, and what they found doesn't cleanly fit a normal timeline. The car had been sitting at the airport in Huntsville for about 4 hours that morning, something his family says was completely unplanned and out of character for Joshua. No clear explanation for why he was there, no communication, no indication of what he was doing during that time. So now you're left with this sequence. Missing in the early morning, no phone, no wallet, unexplained time spent at the airport, then a fiery crash hours later that destroys both the vehicle and the body to the point of near non-recognition. And again, on paper, it's ruled a crash, but when you actually look at the details, none of this is cleanly. Which brings us to the next case. Stephen Garcia, a 48-year-old government security contractor tied to the Kansas City National Security Campus, a site that plays a critical role in the United States' nuclear infrastructure. This isn't just any facility. It manufactures more than 80% of the non-nuclear components used in the country's nuclear weapons systems. Garcia worked out of its New Mexico operations and reportedly had top-level security clearance as a property custodian, meaning he had access, oversight, and responsibility within a highly sensitive environment tied directly to national defense. And then on August 28, 2025, just 2 days before his 48th birthday, vanished. According to officials, Garcia was last seen leaving his home in Albuquerque on foot, carrying only a handgun. No packed belongings, no clear plan, no communication explaining where he was going or why, and after that, nothing. No confirmed sightings, no recovery, no explanation, just another disappearance that drops into the same category we've seen over and over again in this video. Now, again, on its own, you could try to frame this as an isolated case. Which brings us to the next case. Carl Grollmeier was a 67-year-old astrophysicist originally from Calgary who spent decades working at the California Institute of Technology, specifically within its infrared processing and analysis center, which works closely with NASA. He wasn't fringe. He was highly respected in his field, known for work studying deep space, exoplanets, and galactic structures. He even received NASA's Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal in 2011. This is someone deeply embedded in academic and government-adjacent research at the highest level. And then in February 2026, he was shot and killed outside his home in Southern California. Now, unlike the other cases, this one doesn't come with missing persons reports or unclear timelines. Within 2 days, a suspect, a 29-year-old man, was arrested and charged with a murder. Law enforcement has indicated that they don't believe the victim and the alleged killer had any personal connection. But at the same time, they appear confident that they have the person responsible. That's what makes all of this so strange. In most cases like this, you can trace it back to something, personal conflict, financial issues, some kind of interaction. Here you have a highly accomplished astrophysicist being shot outside his home by someone who, on paper, didn't know him with no publicly established reason why. And even though law enforcement has made an arrest and appears confident in the case, the missing piece, the why, is still sitting there unanswered, which is exactly the kind of gap that keeps people questioning what actually happened in this situation, which strangely pairs up with a case that appears to be resolved on paper, but still has many questions. Nuno Loureiro was a renowned professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, specifically in nuclear science and engineering, and had recently been named director of MIT's Plasma Science and Fusion Center. This is far from low-level academic work. This is cutting-edge research tied to fusion energy, plasma physics, and in many cases overlapping with the Department of Energy and potentially defense-adjacent research. By all accounts, Nuno was respected, well-liked, and deeply embedded in one of the most advanced scientific institutions in the nation and the world, likely. And then in December 2025, he was shot and killed in his own home. Now, the details are as unsettling as they are specific. He was at home with his family, his wife, his children, their grandmother. Just a normal evening. Around 8:30 p.m., the doorbell rings. His daughter goes to check it, sees a man in the lobby who appears to be holding a package. Loureiro tells her to come back inside. Moments later, 3 or 4 gunshots. She runs back and finds her father on the ground. The suspect flees, gets into a car, and disappears. Loureiro later dies from his injuries at the hospital. Now, again, on paper, there is an answer. Police identify a suspect, Claudio Manuel Neves Valente. And here's a key detail. Investigators say Loureiro and the suspect knew each other from attending the same university program in Portugal decades earlier, between 1995 and 2000. So immediately that introduces a possible personal connection, something that, at least superficially, explains how the suspect knew who he was. But when you actually look at the execution of this, it doesn't feel like a spontaneous act. Surveillance footage shows a suspect's vehicle circling the area multiple times before the shooting. He's seen earlier in the day moving through different locations, wearing a mask and gloves, paying in cash. Clearly deliberate behavior. And after the shooting, the vehicle is caught on camera driving away with his headlights and taillights off. This is planned, methodical movement, not something impulsive. And then, the next day, the suspect is found dead by suicide. So just like the Grollmeier case, the question isn't whether there's an explanation, it's whether the explanation fully accounts for everything. Because yes, they knew each other decades ago, but what's the motive? What actually triggered this? Why this level of planning? Why now? And why is someone operating at this level targeting a high-profile scientist in his home in front of his family? Which brings us to the next case. Jason Thomas was a 45-year-old scientist working at Novartis, and in December 2025, he disappeared from his home in Massachusetts. According to reports, everything about that night initially seemed normal. He and his wife had gone out, taken care of their dogs, and returned home. But sometime later that evening, he stepped outside and never came back. His wife later realized he was missing, and when she looked closer, key details just didn't line up. His phone and wallet were left behind in the house. His Apple Watch was found in the mailbox he had opened earlier that night, and surveillance footage later showed him walking near train tracks not far from his home. Now, months go by, extensive search efforts, canine units, drones, coordinated law enforcement, and nothing turns up. And then in March 2026, a body is recovered from Lake Quannapowitt. Based on preliminary information, including clothing, officials believe it to be Jason Thomas. At this point, authorities have stated that no foul play is suspected. Which brings us to retired U.S. Air Force Major General William Neil McCasland, 68 years old, disappeared from his home in New Mexico on February 27th, 2026. And just like we've seen in some of the other cases here, the initial details follow a very similar structure. He was last seen at home. His wife reported him missing later that same day. And when authorities looked into it, they found that his phone, his prescription glasses, and other personal belongings had been left behind. Now, on paper, this is being treated as a missing person case. Authorities, including the FBI and local law enforcement, have repeatedly stated that there is no evidence of foul play. The investigation remains active, and officials have emphasized that they are focusing only on verified information, not speculation. But here's where the context starts to matter. McCasland wasn't just anyone. He was the former commander of the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, overseeing billions of dollars in research and development tied to aerospace, defense, and advanced technology. This is one of the central hubs for U.S. military research, and historically, it's also been associated with programs like Project Blue Book, the government's official investigation into UFO sightings during the Cold War. The timing of McCasland's disappearance has also raised a lot of questions, specifically considering the timing of him disappearing with some of the statements made by the president about UAPs and releasing of information relating to UAPs. Which brings us to one of the most recent and bizarre cases that got a lot of publicity. David Wilcock was 53 years old, widely known for his appearances on the TV show Ancient Aliens and for building a large online following around UFOs, government conspiracies, and paranormal topics. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't working inside NASA labs or nuclear facilities, but he was part of the broader ecosystem of people talking about these ideas, shaping narratives, and influencing how the public interprets them. He had hundreds of thousands of subscribers online, best-selling books, and a significant audience that followed his work closely. And in April of 2026, just a few days ago, he died by suicide. According to authorities, deputies responded to a call about a possible mental health crisis in Boulder County, Colorado. When they arrived, they encountered Wilcock outside a residence holding a weapon. Within minutes, he used that weapon on himself and was pronounced dead at the scene. His family later confirmed that he had been struggling with depression and overwhelming financial stress for a long time, and they were very clear in their statement there was no foul play. They emphasized his mental health struggles and asked that his death not be turned into something it wasn't. Now, on paper, this is one of the clearest cases we've looked at. There's a documented history of mental health challenges, a confirmed incident, a family statement, and a direct explanation for what happened. But even with all of that, his name still got pulled into this broader conversation. And that's where things start to say more about the environment than any individual case. Because almost immediately, people began drawing parallels. They pointed to the timing. They pointed to the fact that he had publicly said he would never take his own life. They pointed to the broader pattern of scientists and researchers dying and disappearing as we've been examining. And suddenly, even a case with what appears to be a clear explanation starts getting absorbed into a much larger narrative.
Every day that I have on Earth is a gift and a blessing, and I'm very grateful for that because, frankly, people are disappearing. Scientists are going missing. Now they're saying they're going to investigate this. The president himself is saying they're going to look into this and see if anything's going on. It's a little bit scary. I got to say, it's a little bit scary, but you guys knew that I might still show up even though it was last minute and I've had a really rough week. Like, you know, that's kind of like every week, but somehow we keep on making it through all of this.
Now, that was one of the last clips he posted, and it's only contributed to raising even more questions and speculation, feeding this entire narrative around disappearing and dying scientists. Which brings us to a case from a few years ago that has now resurfaced and has been getting a lot of attention. Matthew Sullivan was a 39-year-old former Air Force intelligence officer, a Bronze Star recipient, and someone who had worked across multiple high-level agencies, including the Air Force Force Intelligence Agency, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, and the National Security Agency. This isn't a peripheral figure. This is someone deeply embedded in national security infrastructure, someone with access to sensitive information, and according to reporting, someone who had agreed to testify before Congress about alleged government UFO programs. And then in May 2024, he was found dead in his home in Falls Church, Virginia. The official cause of death at the time, an accidental drug overdose, a lethal combination of alcohol and prescription medications. On its own, that's a clear medical explanation. Cases like that happen and they're documented. But again, it's not just the cause, it's the timing. Because as I mentioned, Sullivan had reportedly agreed to testify before Congress just months later in November 2024 regarding what has been described as a legacy UFO program allegedly involving crash retrieval and longstanding classified efforts within the government. And according to sources cited in reporting, he was prepared to provide direct testimony on that subject. Now, Representative Eric Burlison has publicly raised questions about this case, calling the circumstances of grave concern and referring it to the FBI for further investigation, specifically citing national security implications. The FBI itself has acknowledged that it is looking into potential connections between multiple cases, all the ones that we discussed involving missing or deceased individuals tied to scientific and defense-related work. Now, all that being said, there is a recent report that was just released. A trove of documents has surfaced from a former cybersecurity chief at Los Alamos National Laboratory, the same facility tied to multiple disappearances we've already discussed. These documents were reportedly discovered after his death by a family member and passed along to journalist Jeremy Corbell, who claims they contain evidence that the U.S. government has been conducting UFO-related research for decades. Now, again, on its own, that's a big claim, but here's where it starts to matter in the context of everything else, because the lab in question, Los Alamos, is not just any research facility. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of the most sensitive sites in the country, historically tied to nuclear weapons development, advanced research, and classified government programs. And more importantly, it's the same place connected to multiple individuals we've already discussed. People like Melissa Casillas and Anthony Chavez, both of whom disappeared under circumstances that still haven't been fully explained. Okay, now, all that being said, where does this lead us? Why is there so much attention going to these deaths and disappearances? Why does there appear to be a connection or a deliberate attempt to make a connection between all of these elements? Why are we seeing government officials, representatives, as well as the president stepping forward and talking about all of this? Why are we seeing channels like News Nation and Fox News starting to push this narrative out there, asking questions, bringing public attention to this, without there ever appearing to be any sort of reasonable, substantive explanation for anything that's tied to this, or even UAPs or UFOs more broadly? We just, again, keep being told year after year that we are going to receive a trove of information that this and this is going to happen. And what do we actually get? We get things like the material that we're seeing right next to me right here, presented as part of a trove of leaked documents, literally hand drawings that look like a 12-year-old could have done, showing what appears to be plans for a UFO. And this is supposed to prove that the United States is studying UFOs and UAPs? Again, where's this all supposed to lead? What's the end game? What's the timing here? Well, let's just take a second and step back and actually analyze what's going on. We have a situation right now where we are caught up in a foreign war, another foreign war. We have one of our so-called greatest allies, that being Israel, pushing us further into conflict with Iran. We have energy prices going through the roof as a result of that conflict. We have the Strait of Hormuz just being shut down, which is in turn causing all of that. We have major economies like Japan facing instability. We're looking at the potential establishment of a new world order where America's role as a global reserve currency, as well as the greatest military superpower in the history of the world and enforcer of that world order, could fundamentally change. At the same time, we have pressure to reshape alliances in the Gulf region, to bring in Iran into OPEC. We have Israel expanding its regional posture, including into southern Lebanon. We have Europe once again facing instability. We have Germany rebuilding its military. There's a lot of chaos happening all at once. Things appear to be completely out of control. And domestically, you have Donald Trump losing support to levels we haven't really seen before, not even at the worst points of COVID. And on top of that, you have the midterms coming up with primaries just around the corner, especially in states like California, that are going to define the next phase of political power. So we're looking at a moment of serious instability. And we're also looking at an administration that wants to maintain control of the levers of power so that the final years of Trump's presidency don't turn into a situation where he's either impeached again or reduced to a lame duck president facing nonstop opposition. Now, all that being said, what I'm about to say is purely speculative. It's my opinion, but I believe this is part of a broader effort to distract from all of these issues, and I believe this is all strategic. Now, I also want to be clear about something. I do believe that alien life exists. I do believe that some of that life could be more advanced than we are. I do believe that there are forms of intelligence and knowledge that extend far beyond what humans currently understand about the universe. And yes, I do think it's possible that some form of non-human intelligence has interacted with our planet, maybe even in covert ways. And there are different opinions about whether or not something that advanced would even have an interest in collaborating with governments like ours. But even with all of that, I've noticed a pattern. When it comes to the UFO narrative, we almost never get real information. There's a lot of noise, hearings, headlines, statements, but the substance is always lacking. The footage is always blurry. The evidence is always inconclusive. And this is happening in a world where we all, by the majority, have 4K cameras everywhere. Some of the most advanced drones ever created and the most sophisticated military aircrafts in human history. Yet somehow the footage we get to look at, it always looks like it's shot in a potato. It's shaky, unclear, and it doesn't match the technological capabilities we know exists. So how do you reconcile all of that? How do you reconcile the constant raising of questions with the lack of answers and the timing of when these narratives are pushed back into the spotlight, especially during moments of economic, political, and cultural instability? Because there is a very real reason to bring something like this back into public focus. There's a reason to connect these cases, to group together deaths, disappearances, and leaked information into a broader narrative. And that's where this ties into something very real. Psychological operations, commonly known as PSYOPs. You know, the use of narratives, repetition, and emotional triggers to guide public perception, highlighting certain events, amplifying them, while downplaying or ignoring others. And more specifically, what's often described as pattern amplification. You take scattered events, real events, and present them as part of a larger, coordinated pattern, and you don't necessarily tell people what to think. You just lay out the pieces in a way that encourages them to connect the dots themselves. And that's what makes all of this more powerful, because people trust conclusions they arrive at on their own. When you have these two psychological elements working in conjunction, you create an environment where the public effectively distracts itself from the realities that are at hand, because instead of focusing on clear, tangible issues, people get pulled into trying to decode patterns, connect the dots between disappearances and murders, and chase unanswered questions. The attention shifts away from what's concrete and immediate and toward something that is constantly just out of reach, something that keeps evolving, keeps expanding, but never fully resolves. And in that environment, the conversation sustains itself. It feeds itself. The longer it goes on without clear answers, the more effective it becomes at holding attention exactly where it's been directed. And that's where the benefit to our government comes in, because this kind of distraction redirects public attention away from the issues that are immediate, measurable, and politically consequential. Things like economic strain, foreign policy decisions, and bad decisions of that, as well as domestic instability. All of that gets guided toward narratives that are open-ended and difficult to resolve. When people are often focused on speculation and trying to piece together incomplete information, it reduces pressure for accountability on decisions that actually have direct impacts. It fragments attention. People aren't unified around a single clear issue. They're divided across competing interpretations and theories, and in that environment, it becomes easier to manage perception, control the pace of information, and avoid having to provide definitive answers on matters where clarity would normally be demanded. Now, look, all that being said, what happened to each individual we discuss here today is a tragedy. There needs to be more clarity about what happened to each of them, not just for the public's sake, but for their families. I think it's in the interest of the American people to understand why individuals with high levels of clearance, extremely intelligent, would in some cases just leave everything behind and disappear, or in other instances be killed in ways that still leaves a lot of questions. These are people with access to information to help shape the future of this country and the world. And if there is some kind of operation targeting them, if there are cases of defection, or even if you want to go as far as more speculative explanations, maybe they got abducted by aliens, the public deserves more clarity, and so do the people closest to them. Anyway, folks, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.